So I also like to say it like this. It's a collaboration in which both the mathematicians and the art historians actually got something out of it. So in the second half of this presentation, I will be talking about work I'm doing with the North Carolina Museum of Art. But before I do, and that will be done with postdocs and collaborators, and Rachel Yin is a graduate student, with art conservators and art historians at the museum, and with a Dutch artist, and you'll hear more about her. But before I do that, I'm going to tell you about two examples of mathematicians other than myself who helped art historians and conservators. The first one of those is Massimo Fornaziere, who helped with the reconstruction of very famous frescoes in the Eremitani Church in Padua, Italy. So this church had been bombed at the end of the Second World War by mistake, but nothing remained of beautiful frescoes by Andrea Mantegna that were world famous, and that here you see in an earlier kind of reconstruction in the chapel. The bottom two, which are in color here, actually are the original frescoes. They happened because they had water damage to not be in the chapel at the time. They had been removed and they were in a conservation lab. But all the rest was reduced to this kind of rubble. So after the bombardment, boxes and boxes of this rubble was collected. And every so often, art conservators since 1945 would try to see whether they could make something of it. But, I mean, they would give up because it was such an impossible task. And in the early 90s, it was felt that maybe now it might be possible to do something computationally. And so all the fragments were collected, and they were cleaned, consolidated, and cataloged, and they were, with high resolution, photographed and put on CDs. And so whoever wanted to contribute to a solution of putting things, of trying to assemble them, got the CDs and tried to work on that. So you see here, these are fragments that are very small. I mean, this is the front. On the back, they were numbered, so they were uniquely numbered. And they had very little, they had no context. Now, when we saw the reconstruction, you saw this black and white photograph. That was, they had photographs without color of the frescoes from the 30s. And so they could change, I mean, they could correct for the parallax, and they knew the dimensions. And so they could make photographs that were exactly to scale of the frescoes in black and white. So they had, if you wish, a big, enormous jigsaw puzzle, and they had the box, they had a picture. I mean, on the other hand, they had only maybe 10% of the pieces. So, at an enormous scale. So not only, and with a jigsaw puzzle, usually you can, in many puzzles, you know that the piece is either this way or that way, but you know it's not going to be oblique. That was not the case. Here we had pieces with unknown orientation. Now, how could you try to do something computationally with these things? So if you have a digital image, or an image when it's digitized, let's think of it in black and white, so just grayscale. You have to imagine it in color as well, but what happens is that you have many, many, many pixels that are very small and are put together, and each pixel has just one grayscale. And often that's digitized in what's called 8 bits. That means is that you have 256 levels going from all black, 0, to 255, all white. And in between, the numbers gradually, as they go higher, become lighter and lighter shades of gray. And so what that means is that your image can be translated into an enormous array of numbers between 0 and 255. And then once you have these numbers, you can compute with those. You could take the average of neighboring pixels. You can do lots of things with them, and that's what we do in image processing, in digital image processing. And so you might think that it's easy to decide whether two images are identical. You say, we just look at the numbers, and if they're the same, then they're identical. Well, it's not that simple, because if you, in order to digitize the image, you put yourself in a slightly different position, then although the image looks virtually the same, the numbers are going to be different, because you've taken average over slightly different spots in order to, and not only that, but you might also have rotations. I mean, so if you have here these two images, these two arrays of numbers are two arrays that came from a small portion of an image, and then I rotated it, and I computed the numbers again. It's very hard to see just from the numbers that that's the same image. So what you have to do is to think of a way of representing the information in a kind of rotationally invariant way. And the numbers from the digitizations are not such a representation. So Massimo Fornazier came up with a solution that ultimately was implemented in order to reconstruct these frescoes. So he said, look, if I take a disk of content on a fragment, then I can decompose that, it's a circular image, into circular harmonics. And here are examples of circular harmonics. And here, so if I have an image, I can write it as a linear combination of these building blocks that I'm showing you here. And here's an example. I mean, here is as gradually we're building up more and more. We start with this one and so on. And I'm adding building blocks with the right multiple every time as we go horizontally in this. And in the end, by taking the building blocks that you saw earlier, which were very simple, but taking them with exactly the right multiple, I get an image. And so we can do that, and we can decompose fast in these building blocks. We can compute the coefficients in this linear combination, these A1, A2, and so on, easily. Now, if you now rotate the image, we know very well what a rotation does to each of these building blocks. Look, I mean, these were the building blocks. It's very easy to see what you do with such blocks when you rotate. So each of them become just a multiple of itself. And we know which multiple. So we can compute without having to decompose again what any rotation would be of that image after we've decomposed it once. And then what we can do is, so we take our disk image, we decompose. And then we look at all these possible representations of rotated versions, and we check with the original big box where it fits best. And you can do that, and that way you can check where the piece should fit. And so that was done. I mean, after Massimo proposed this, we're talking of late 90s now. I mean, this is one when a supercomputer could do less than your iPhone now. I mean, computation has made a lot of progress in 20 years. So they started a Mantegna project in which volunteers of many different organizations and even people who had technical expertise and who stepped in from the street could come and volunteer in the Mant lab, in a lab where they would do human-assisted checking of these pieces. So what would happen is that a fragment would be selected at random. Then people would look at the biggest disk that they could take on the piece of fragment. They would decompose, and then in the computation would search for fragments that were the most likely. So it would give you a list, and so here a fragment has been taken, and you already see here it illustrates that for this fragment, the largest disk here was this disk. And that disk was then compared to the big black and white thing. And you would find there were 3 places. These were the 3 best fits. And a human would then decide, no, it's really the top one. I mean, most of the time it was the top one. Not always, but it was always among the top 3. And in fact, the art historians were very happy with the fact that a human intervention was necessary to make it 100%, because they didn't like it as much if it were just computational. Actually, machine learning it turns out that for delicate tasks, doing something semi-automatic like that, having a human decision, speeds up things enormously and makes the computation also programming. I mean, doing something 100% by computation is much harder than doing it right 99% of the time. Okay, so of the 80,735 fragments that had content, all of them were placed, and they helped then reconstruct. So here is one of the frescoes on which all these fragments are located. This gives you an idea of how little of the whole content had been preserved. A funny thing happened, I mean, when there's a lot of publicity was given to this whole initiative in Padua when this was happened, when this computational effort was happening, and people would bring extra fragments. They said, my grandfather had actually collected one, and we knew, and so on. I always felt guilty, but can you, so that it was only a very small percentage, but it was nice that people felt involved. So they, oops, sorry, I don't know what's happening here. Okay, so here's another one. And now what you can ask yourself, what good does it do to have this? Well, when art conservators, art historians, they can do a lot with even a modest fragment, because it enables you to color a whole lot more. Imagine if you have this information. You know now what color the flagstones are. You know what the color is of the spear, of the leather, of the sandal, of the flesh tone, since you have his toe. So you can actually reconstruct much more. Here again. So for many of these places, having a little bit of information would allow you to spread the color. And that's what art historians typically do. And that is what we can do computationally as well. I mean, here, suppose you have this information. I can make it this from having the black and white. I mean, so here you see a piece of the reconstructed fresco as it was in progress. And what was being done here was that the art historians were doing the in-painting, progressing from a little bit of color and propagating it further and further and further out. And this is that fresco as you see it now if you visit the church in Padua. They decided to actually show some pieces of it in fully reconstructed color, and in others show what the fragments in place, but without the recoloring. But you can also, this propagating and so on, you can also model mathematically. And Massimo, that's the second thing he did. He built an algorithm that also can, from the same idea, give you a virtual reconstruction of the whole fresco with the vivid colors and not the pastel colors that the art conservators chose in order to accentuate the difference between the true and the reconstructed things. So, so this makes it possible to reimagine the frescoes as they were. And this work got a lot of publicity, and Massimo got a big European award for this work. The other example I wanted to show you of work in which mathematics contributed is one that actually came out a little bit by accident. So Rick Johnson, who is the person who got me into studying image processing for art conservation and art history, was working with the people at the Van Gogh Museum, and we were trying to convince them that image processing could do a lot for them. And while doing that, he learned that they were constructing a catalogue raisonné, which is a catalog that art historians make, in which they give every bit of scholarship that is known about every painting in the collection. And he found out that they typically, in such a catalogue raisonné of paintings on canvas, try to characterize the canvas on which the painting is made. And so here, if you look at the X-ray of the painting that we just saw, then you can clearly see the horizontal and vertical threads of that canvas. And typically the X-rays is how you study the canvas, because in Van Gogh's case, as in many other paintings, the painting themselves have been relined. What that means is that the threads, the canvas, the fabric underneath had started to decay and under the influence of the corrosive elements in the oil paint. And so in order to preserve the integrity of the painting, what art conservators then do is they attach another piece of canvas to the back, a canvas that is better prepared to withstand the chemicals. And also the paint by then has leached out a lot of its corrosive elements. So what that means is that at the back, if you see another piece of canvas that has nothing to do anymore with the original. You could say, well, on the original you can look at where the valleys and mountains are. Well, no, because the way the Van Gogh paintings had been relined is that they had ironed this canvas on, so actually all the relief and some of the impasto that Van Gogh painted and so on is much flatter now because of this ironing. But so how come then we see it on the X-rays? Well, of course, X-rays would not see canvas because fabric is something you see straight through with X-rays. But in order to prepare a canvas to paint on it, you put a layer on it that makes it much less absorbent. I mean, so that shields the fabric from, also to help the fabric preserve its integrity a little longer. I mean, it's not long enough, but still. And that layer is a primer, which until very recently typically contained a lot of lead white. And the lead white, of course, if you have something with valleys and mountains, then you have a little bit more in the valleys and a little bit less on the mountains. And that lead white absorbs X-rays a lot. So what happens is that you get a negative of the canvas structure in your X-ray. You can turn that back in a positive if you wish. And so from the primer, you get the canvas. So the canvas is not always, I was talking about horizontal and vertical threads. It's not always, I mean, here you see that the threads are clearly quite bent. And that's because the primer may be done on the canvas when there's already a little bit of structure. And once the primer is on, you cannot stretch that out. It's very rigid at that point. You can stretch it on a stretcher, but if things were a little bit wavy, then they're going to be wavy forever. So the way canvas was characterized until 10 years ago is that art conservators would look at, under a microscope, at these X-rays, and they would count. I mean, so many threads, and they would add so many threads. And I mean, after having done that in 6 spots on one painting, and if you have to do 100 of paintings, I mean, your eyes kind of glaze over. And so it was very tedious work, and they did it Spotify. And when Rick and when I heard that, we said, well, that is something we can do computationally, because what you're seeing is something that's fairly periodic. I mean, Fourier transforms are great for that. And so you can actually find that periodicity. And so we could do it anywhere, everywhere. They said, really? And so that's what Rick did. He worked with undergrads to build programs that would do this. And he then would display the information in, that was a very felicitous way he found of displaying it. People who work with MATLAB recognize the MATLAB colors here. So what he did is he said, okay, on average we have these numbers, horizontally and vertically. But it's not completely always the same. These fabrics are sometimes a little denser, sometimes a little looser. And so for the horizontal direction, for instance, he was showing the density of weave, and he showed it with colors, a little bit above, a little bit below. He also would show the angle. I mean, as you know, as we know, the angle is not always constant, and so with the Fourier transform, you could find the angle that things were really tilted at, and he would display that as well, also in color. So that meant that for one piece of canvas, he had two vertical things, namely density and angle, and two horizontal ones, density and angle. And so with these four pictures, when he showed those to people, they realized that you had a kind of fingerprint of the canvas. And here are two paintings that Van Gogh, like many people, would buy long pieces of canvas and cut them into pieces and put them on stretchers, because that was much more cost-effective. And so you can see that some paintings are roll-mates. They came from the same roll of fabric, which meant he painted them very close to each other, I mean the same period. And so here, of these paintings that are from his Arles period, we know that they were on the roll like that because one of the informations gives you this and the other one gives you that, and you see that things are nicely propagated. This way of characterizing roll-mates has already led to paintings for which attribution was not quite certain to be reattributed or deattributed. There's, for instance, a Velázquez in the Prado that people had started to doubt because it was not really of the same high quality as other paintings of the master at that time. They said, well, it's probably a student. But then they found that it was a roll-mate of paintings that are undoubtedly Velázquez, and since he was not in the habit of sharing his canvas, it's now been reattributed. Okay, so these are very nice examples. The second example is really one where the benefits came out of it only after the thing had been put in practice. The idea was to make it easier to not have to look under the microscope, and then all of a sudden other things could be done. And that's one of the fun things that you can, that as more as possible, new uses are found for the information. Okay, so under the influence of Rick Johnson, I started work on applications of image analysis to art history. The very first project we worked on was a challenge by the Van Gogh Museum, was trying to see whether we could distinguish style or distinguish original from copies, and we could do that. But what was more interesting was that when I talked about the success of that, somebody came up and said, if you can do that, maybe you can help with this. And so from one project to another, we got into more interesting questions. So the first one of these new challenges was this project that I like to call Lady 6 millimeters Under, which was a project to do with a painting underneath a Van Gogh painting of the Paris period. So under this painting, which is just a study of grasses in bloom, it was known that if you put it on its side and x-rayed it, then you saw there was another painting underneath. In this case, it shows a portrait of a woman. Now, the fact that there's something else underneath is not so peculiar, not so unique. Van Gogh actually reused canvas a lot, and so when he made a study, when he felt that he had learned what he could out of this study, he would often put a new layer of primer and paint again. So about 30% of his paintings have something else underneath. The reason this painting is intrigued people is that it's from his Paris period, the top painting, and that in the correspondence between Vincent van Gogh and his brother Theo, which has been completely preserved, there was a letter of the time when Vincent was in the Netherlands and his brother was in Paris, where he just says, I have been working a lot on trying to render an impression of color with a very somber and restricted palette. And indeed, we have many, many portraits of poor peasants in dark circumstances from this period. He says, and I'm sending you here one in which I believe I particularly well succeeded in what I wanted to do. Now, that letter is preserved, the painting we don't have. Since this was a portrait underneath a Paris painting, and since it's completely understandable, given that Van Gogh changed his style completely under the influence of the Impressionists when he reached Paris, that he might not have valued anymore that painting that he valued so much 2 years before, that he would have used it to paint over again. So it's believed that this was that painting, and so people were interested in knowing more. And Koen Janssen and Joris Dick who made the cover of Analytical Chemistry with their work on this, had the idea of using X-ray fluorescence. So high energy X-ray was used to illuminate pixel by pixel, so one pixel at a time, this painting. And then from the fluorescence, in fluorescence, what happens is that atoms get ionized, and then the electron falls back in 2 steps. So the second step is between one level and another level of the bound electron. And so you have an energy difference, and that for a wave difference of the photon that's sent out, that is very characteristic for the element you're looking at. So it tells you, if you do this with a wide spectrum and you look at all of them, then you can see in some places, oh, that's the wavelength that corresponds to arsine, which was a component of the red, that vermilion that Van Gogh was using. Or this is these are pixels that have a lot of intensity in the wavelength for antimony, which was part of the Naples yellow he was using. And so they did that, and using that, they then used some color. They said, okay, let's use the red for the arsine, the yellow, and so on, and they could colorify a little bit better, and they got to this picture, which people were very excited because they had not had so clear a picture. But Joris Dick, after I gave a talk, said, could you maybe do better than this? Because after all, once we give you data, the rest is image analysis, and you guys know more. And okay, and so we did. We worked on this. The first thing we had to do was actually we had to correct for errors that had been made in the registration. The way these X-ray data had been taken, I mean, in order to get very powerful X-rays, I mean, now there are new portable machines that have been built for art historians to do this. But at that time, this was over 10 years ago, this did not exist yet. And so they had obtained the permission of the Van Gogh Museum to take this, after all, fairly minor study, to a high-energy X-ray machine, a synchrotron, in a medical facility, where these machines are used to make short-lived radioactive elements that are then used in order to test tumors and so on. So now these machines are very expensive, and so often hospitals that acquire a machine like that work with physics teams that use the beam for physics experiments when it's not doing its day job for medical stuff. And so they had gotten time on the beam to work to illuminate this painting pixel by pixel. Now, of course, the beam is always in one direction. I mean, so you have the beam going for the medical, and then when it's not, then you beam it in some other, but that plays in one place. So it's, if you want to go from pixel to pixel, you move the painting, not the beam. Okay, but every so often, actually fairly often, the beam has to go back to its day job. So the sled on which the painting was moving had to be synchronized between when the beam was there or wasn't there. And it turned out there was a mistake in the programming of that, and the synchrony was not perfect. And that's why, and because the scanning was done in zigzag like that, that's why you have these kind of zigzaggy patterns here. I mean, they were dark blobs because there was a lot of impasto on the top painting, so the X-ray had not penetrated. So this should be a dark, coherent blob, but because of the synchrony problem, they had been torn apart in 2 directions. Now, here it's very obvious, and in their first publication, Joris Dick and Koen Janssen had kind of corrected that by hand. But there were breaks like that in every line, and often they were less. And so the first thing we had to do was correct for this. So we designed a variational algorithm that went through the whole thing, back and forth. We used, of course, total variation. We minimized total variation, and in order to get things well adjusted. And so we found an automatic way of doing that correction. But then next, we also have all these places where we have no information. Now, we have no information except for the fact that this is a painting. Often where we had no information, you can see the brushstroke arriving and then going further. So you can reconstruct what it likely was in between. And we did that. And there are in-painting algorithms that will do that. And so here on the right, we put first the mask, and then we reconstructed. Then we had these long things from the grasses on top. We did a different reconstruction for that. We put a mask, and we reconstructed. And then we still had problems at that one eye. And we said, well, what do we do there? And the art conservator said, oh, you use the other eye. We do that all the time. So we did that too. And so we now had a much cleaner version of the painting. And you see here how delicate this in-painting happens. I mean, on the right, you have these black thingies, and how nicely they have been removed. Plastic surgery on paintings. So in order to then get the color information after all the black spots had been removed, we had, of course, we knew that we had the antimony, we had the arsine. We didn't have the earth colors. I mean, because they didn't correspond to the spectrum. I mean, none of the ochres or so on. So what happened is that we, however, analyzed many of the other portraits that Van Gogh had painted, some with very low, some with very high contrast. And although it was not apparent to the eye, once you started analyzing chromans, you could see that there was a systematics to it, even though there was this very wide range of contrast, that we then extrapolated to this painting. And we got to this version of it, which made her come much more alive. So this was work about which, when I moved to Duke, the North Carolina art conservators had heard. And by accident, well, not by accident, but by good fortune, we met at a meeting, a symposium at the university, and they said, they asked, would I like to work with them on some of the paintings in their collection? And that's how we started. So the first painting on which we started is something about which I won't tell you, except that it's work in progress. And we hope to finish it, to revisit it again, is on this very, very, very famous altarpiece by Giotto. It's very famous because it's one of the earliest altarpieces where you see a deviation from Byzantine, very hieratic structure of iconic ways of depicting the saints to something that's a little bit more naturalistic. I mean, especially in John the Baptist and in St. Francis, you see a little bit more modeling, a bit more naturalistic poses for that time at least. But as we were talking about, and during a break, about interesting projects, Bill Brown, head conservator at the museum, mentioned to me a dream he had about a less famous altarpiece of Francescuccio Gissi that was a little later, late 14th century instead of early 14th century, of which the North Carolina Museum of Art has 3 panels. 3 others belong to the Metropolitan Museum, 1 to the Museum of Fine Art in Portland, 1 in the Museum of Chicago, and the 9th one has been missing forever. Well, forever, ever since this altarpiece was broken up. In the end of the 19th century, this art was much less appreciated than it is now. It was considered old-fashioned and so on. It was in a church in a poor region of Italy that probably needed money for repairs, and collectors were starting to collect this. And so many of these pieces of art were first sold to dealers, who then often broke them up because, yes, they could get more money for a full altarpiece than for 1 panel, but they could get even more money for 9 individual panels. And so it was then broken up and sold to different collectors who later donated it to different museums. And so Bill Brown had told me that he'd love to have an exhibition where he would bring all these panels together. But the other museums were not so interested because they said, even if you bring them all together, you still won't have it complete because there's this one that's been missing and we have no idea where it is. And I then told him about an artist who I knew and with whom I'd worked because she's a fantastic artist in her own right, but she's also trained as an art historian and an art conservator, and she makes reconstructions for museums. That's to say, when for educational reasons they want to show something that is painted with the techniques of the time and the materials parallel to that of some time, but where people are allowed to see more or to touch it more than the original, they commissioned that from her. So here you see her painting a copy of a reconstruction of a fragment of a very famous altarpiece in Ghent, where they commissioned that she would make of the same fragment 3 copies, which she stopped at different stages so that people can appreciate the different intermediate stages before the whole thing is finished. Here's another one that she painted like that, in which she, for a museum in Rotterdam, where here she stopped about 1 centimeter short every time at every next stage. So you have a number of stages of treating the wood. And then you have a number of stages of putting the gesso layer on, the white layer for the whole thing. And then you have the drawing and fixing the drawing. Then you start putting in the bowl layer here. These are underlayers that make it possible to gild. And then the gilding is applied and polished and so on. And so you see how many, actually between here and there's 6 months. Because many of these layers need some time to mature. So I had worked with Charlotte on several projects. And for instance, the first project, remember I told you about originals and copies? Well, the Van Gogh Museum had challenged us, and this had been filmed by a NOVA program, whether we could detect the one thing that had been a copy that Charlotte had painted from a series of 5 other paintings that were by Van Gogh. We had not been told which one, and we had to find just from the brushwork, and we had succeeded. I had commissioned from her another series where she made the originals and the copies, and you see her here in my house. So I have this whole collection of tchotchkes in my house that are painted in originals and then copied by her herself using her copyist techniques, so not trying to repaint it. She came to North Carolina and we made a whole series of bird portraits. This is different from the earlier in that we didn't know. We know for the top ones, we knew which ones were the originals and the copies, but we don't know for the others. And so as our techniques get better, one student after another makes a guess. We have a public unveiling of the information, and so far they have all been right. In any case, so I said, you could do something very interesting. You could have her come and reconstruct that 9th panel. And they really liked the idea. Because you could say, well, we don't have the painting. Well, but the series of small paintings depicts the life of John the Evangelist. Not just the life of John the Evangelist, but the life with episodes from a very famous medieval book called The Golden Legend, which had lives of many saints, and which was a real bestseller. We know it was a bestseller because many of these medieval books, we have maybe 1 or 2 copies or so on. This we have hundreds. So apparently everyone had one. So since they followed the scenes of that book, and we have the earlier scenes here, they could guess what the final scene should be. And what it is the baptism of the man who's standing here on the right, very skeptical, who says, well, if your God is so powerful, why don't you drink the dregs of this cup of poison with which we have executed these 2 criminals here, and we'll see. If you don't fall dead, then maybe I will leave you. And of course, he didn't. And so the guy says, oh my God, this is really true. And so he consented to be baptized. And so here are sketches that she made. She went through, so when it was arranged that Charlotte would make this reconstruction, you see she went through lots of stages at home first, because I told you it takes 6 months. She's making the gesso here and then the soft gesso on top. The gesso is a layer that has to be very, very, very smooth and has to have a little bit of elasticity. And a little bit of elasticity is so that gilding and polishing of the gilding is possible. So when you polish gilding, you put on the gold leaf, which is very, very thin because gold is expensive, and you try to rearrange things underneath. There are clay particles underneath that can slide a little bit over each other so that they make an even smoother surface together by your polishing. And for that, the thing has to be already smooth and has to be a little bit elastic, because if it doesn't give, then the gold will be under more stress and will start tearing. So that's the purpose of all these layers. And she knew how to do all that because we actually have a manual from the 14th century that describes all these. She followed every stage of that manual. And so she's massaging it in, she's here. I mean, here what she's doing is, in order to get it really smooth, you put charcoal all over it, and then you scrape it off until every particle of charcoal is gone. I mean, so here she's put the sketch on, she's applying the bowl, she's putting the gold on, and this gold is so thin. I mean, and if I even looked at it, it would crumble. I mean, so you have to be really expert to work with this. And here she's polishing it with an agate that is very similar to the one she has on her ring. Here she's putting in punch marks. I mean, these are very pretty. We'll come back to those punch marks. I mean, she actually had punches made exactly to the shape of the punches that were on the old panels in North Carolina, so that she could make these punches. Here you see her painting. You see actually the background of the faces is very greenish. That's how these colors were actually, these flesh colors were made at that time. They did a greenish thing, and then they put a red, very transparent glaze over, and that gave a depth that really looked like flesh colors. That's why if you go to a European gallery of old paintings, all these people look very unhealthy, because typically the red glaze has faded. And so you see the green stuff underneath much more clearly. So the punch marks are on this polished gold will give lots of reflections when you photograph them. And over time, actually, not only does the polish go away and we can't repolish it because it would tear up the gold, but also in those ridges, more dirt gets trapped. So instead of having this very light effect originally, you get actually a dark effect. It becomes dirty and crusty. So at the end, we had this beautiful, beautiful painting. This whole process was filmed by a documentarist, and so you could put it next to the others. It's this and so on. And then they realized they had a problem, because if they exhibited the reunion of all the pieces with this new one, nobody was going to look at the old ones. They would only have eyes for the one non-authentic, bright, shiny, and so on. And so, and I said, but you know, we could help. Mathematicians can help. We can, in fact, study the old ones, study the new one, study the color remapping, and so on. We can age virtually the new panel. And so that's in the exhibit that is taking place right now in Raleigh. If one of you goes to Raleigh, North Carolina in the next 6 months, you should go visit it. So we aged it virtually, and it was then printed out, and that print was put together with the other panels, and the new panel is put separately, so that you have an idea of the whole, but you also see the new panel and the documentary of how it was made. But of course, if you do, so we have to do all this virtual aging, color remapping, cracks, and so on. But we can, if we'd done all that work, we could also rejuvenate the other panels. We could do the opposite. And so we could give a virtual impression of what these old panels must have looked like when they were new. And we weren't printing them out. That's only done on a screen. And so for that, we had to be able to find and in-paint cracks, because we were not going to do this by hand. This thing is zillions of cracks. Now, you might think, it's easy to detect. You just put your Photoshop on that kind of brown and well, no. I mean, first of all, cracks don't have the same color everywhere. Look at this crack here, the green. It has a very different color from there. It really is a different color. It's not just an optical effect. Part of that is that the crack is underground, exposed after it breaks apart, and the pigment near it influences the decoloration that can happen. There are big cracks, there are small cracks. The brown in a crack is not uniform the same. So, I mean, even if you pick one brown, then you only have part of the cracks, and so on. So we knew how to do that because we had previous experience doing it. Let me mention a few words here. This is, again, this famous altarpiece. Earlier, you saw Charlotte paint a copy here. So this is a very, very famous painting in Ghent, in Belgium, which influenced its time enormously. I mean, there are many, many other paintings in the early Renaissance that that allude to this painting, and art historians know it very well. This painting, when you close it, has a scene here where behind this main figure, there's a book. And, well, it's a painting of a book, of course. And the painting of the book looks like it has these letters on it. And people had been wondering, art historians had been debating whether this was really a text or just a symbolic representation of a text. I mean, I can't read texts like that, but I can't read them in museums either when I see the book. I mean, when it is really a text, because, well, I don't know how to read this funny script. But paleographers who can read that script couldn't read this either. And they said, well, we really are we bothered by all those cracks. It has so many cracks in it, and the paint is here and there a little bit lost and so on, and it's very hard for our eyes to think something like that away. And we had said, well, we can help with that. I mean, and if I'd known how hard it was, I might have kept my mouth, but we did. And this became part of the thesis of a young engineer in Belgium. And we detected all those cracks automatically. We did in-painting. And then when we did, we got stuff like on the right. And I said, well, fat lot of good that's going to do. I mean, it's not more readable. But to experts, it was. In fact, they could now identify groups of words that enabled them to not only say for sure that it was a text, but to identify the text. And the text was a text by Thomas of Aquinas on exactly the Annunciation, which is the scene that's illustrated in that panel. So art historians were delighted. And so we knew we could detect cracks. And so indeed, on the Gissi panel, we can do that too. Here on the right, you see automatic crack detection, and you see how many there are. And we could in-paint them. And this is done with an iterative process. You see here from the left, you see gradually the cracks disappear. They don't completely disappear. I mean, our idea was not to try to make a chromo. Our idea was to do something which was scholarly established and not to take it too far. I mean, just take it as far as we could motivate that what we were doing was solid. And what remained, yes, okay, so be it. So here is for one of these panels, I've removed the gold, I removed the cracks. We could really remove the cracks very nicely. So let me toggle that again. And so on. Next came color remapping. Now, how would we remap colors? Well, we had, for many of the pigments, which had been analyzed, and so Charlotte had used those same pigments. We knew what they looked like new and what they looked like old. And in fact, in the composition, Charlotte had inspired herself a lot by things, and so they were, I mean, this is how I showed you to you earlier. This is actually in the same lighting conditions, what the two panels look like. And because she had made her composition so that she was inspired by the old ones, we have many places where the folds look very similar, and so we could actually do a very nice color remapping. The blue here is azurite, and in order to have a nice blue, at that time, all these pigments were, most of these pigments were stone pigments, mineral pigments. And for azurite, they would not grind it as finely as for the other pigments because that gave a deeper blue If you made it very fine, you got a very flat thing. And that then absorbed much more dust. And so that's why it now mostly looks very black, but it looked very nice and blue before. And so here you have an old panel with cracks removed. And no, this is the new panel, sorry. No, this is the old panel, sorry. An old panel with cracks removed and colors rejuvenated. And here you have the new panel, aged. And now, a very final little twist, and I'll stop very soon. In order to do the crack removal, we had to find the cracks very well. In case of the Altarpiece of Ghent, we had found the cracks by looking at the X-ray panel. And so I said, show us the X-ray. And they showed me an X-ray, and it had this kind of construction on it. So I said, well, what's this nonsense? Don't you find it a nuisance? And they sighed. They said, yes, that is a nuisance. It's the cradle. Cradle. Okay. When these panels were originally something like an inch thick. When they went from being in churches to going to collections, very often, I mean, it's wood, this thick wood, it would warp with temperature and humidity. And these collectors didn't want stuff on their walls that was warping like that. So these panels were thinned. Now, in some cases, it was also because there was some humidity damage, or like here, some worm damage. And so they just removed damaged wood. But in many cases, they just wanted them to hang flatter. And so they thinned them until they were a few millimeters thick, which then they could make flat. And then in order to give it structural stability, they put a cradle on the back. They put hardwood and tunneling hardwood through it. Now, all that was before art historians realized that they could get a lot of information from looking at X-rays of the things. Now, if you take a cradle painting and you look at X-rays, you see nothing but cradle. I mean, you cannot hope to see much, I mean, like here. You cannot hope to see very much about the detail of the brush stroking because the cradle is so dominant. And so in practice, art conservators spend hours and hours and hours before they publish one of these X-ray photographs, removing this with Photoshop. And it's not something where you just take a zone and you adjust the intensity. It's because nothing is truly horizontal or vertical, and the intensity is not quite uniform, and you have wood grain. So you see here wood grain from the cradle. Now, they didn't want the wood grain from the original panel removed, because that gives them information about the painting. They wanted just so my student, Rachel Yin, developed an algorithm that does much better than what a professional art restorer, conservator does with Photoshop. And we developed it. So here you have a couple of examples. This is a painting in NCMA, a detail and removal. Again, you see the wood grain very clearly here and removed. Again, what we tried to do is we wanted to be very careful. We didn't want to embellish the image and make it what we thought would be the best image. We wanted to do a treatment of the image that would then be the first stage on which experts, namely the art conservators, could emphasize details that they wanted. It was not our job to do that. You can imagine that this is very tricky. I mean, you have to learn to distinguish details of the painting from what wood grain details are. And then you have to look at wood grain in places where you know there's only painting and places where you know there's painting and cradle in order to distinguish these two wood grains. I mean, so it's actually a very, very sophisticated machine learning problem. But as I said, Rachel solved it, and we developed a software package of which we hope it's user-friendly, and we've made it available in open source, and so that people can build further on it. And we made it available. We had a workshop a year and a half ago where people learned it. We called it Platypus. And it's now available and spreading to museums around the world. It's been downloaded over 100 times, of which 70 are museums in Asia, in Europe, and in North and South America. So we're very happy with that. So I'm going to stop here. You can find a lot of more information, a lot more pictures at these two websites. The first one is about this whole GISI adventure. And in fact, not only do you have the story there, but you can also download a PDF file that has a whole booklet with essays of several of the people who worked on it. And the second is Project Platypus, which is this cradle removal. So we have many more adventures awaiting us, and which we hope to engage in the future.